There are things you learn about a person only after they die. Not the obvious things, not the safe, polished memories that get passed around at funerals like bread rolls. Not the stories everyone already knows. I'm talking about the other things. The ones that were kept behind locked doors and sealed mouths. The ones that lived in the spaces between what your family said and what they actually meant. My grandfather, Edwin Nez, died on a Tuesday in February, quietly, in his sleep, in the same small house he'd lived in for the last 31 years, on a gravel road outside a town most people in New Mexico have never heard of. He was 81 years old. He had a heart that had been failing slowly for the better part of a decade, and hands that still smelled like cedar smoke even in the hospital, even at the very end. I drove 7 hours to get to the funeral. Interstate 40 through Albuquerque, and then north on roads that got narrower and emptier with every mile, until the land opened up into that particular kind of silence that only exists in the high desert, where the sky is so wide it almost feels like a sound. I hadn't made that drive in almost 3 years, hadn't seen him in 2. That's the kind of thing that doesn't bother you until it's too late to fix, and then it sits in your chest like a stone you swallowed without noticing. The house looked smaller than I remembered. It always did. A single-story cinder block rectangle with a flat roof and windows that were slightly too small, as though the building had been designed by someone who didn't fully trust the outside. There was a juniper tree in the front yard that had been dead for at least a decade, but that my grandfather refused to cut down. He said it still had a purpose. He never said what that purpose was. The family had already gathered by the time I arrived. Aunts, uncles, cousins, some I recognized, some I didn't. My mother was in the kitchen, moving between the stove and the counter with that particular kind of energy that means a person is trying very hard not to feel something. She hugged me and held on a beat too long, and when she pulled back, her eyes were dry but her jaw was tight. "He went easy," she said, "in his sleep." "That's good." "Yeah." She turned back to the stove. "That's good." The service was held the next morning at a small church with adobe walls and a tin roof that pinged in the wind. The pastor spoke about peace and rest and the Lord's embrace. The older relatives sat in the front pews with their hands folded and their faces arranged into expressions I couldn't quite read. Not grief, exactly. Something closer to the look you see on people when a long, exhausting vigil has finally ended. My great-aunt Dorothy, Edwin's older sister, sat beside my mother. At one point during the service, she leaned over and whispered something. My mother stiffened. Dorothy patted her knee and faced forward again. After the service, I asked my mother what Dorothy had said. She shook her head. "Nothing, just you know how she is." But I'd seen my mother's face when she heard it. Whatever Dorothy said, it wasn't nothing. At the reception, I moved through the small crowd, accepting handshakes and half hugs and the quiet condolences of people who had known Edwin far longer and far better than I had. I heard fragments of conversation about his service in the army, about the years he spent working road construction, about the way he could fix anything mechanical with patience and electrical tape. Safe memories, bread roll memories. But I also noticed something else, a current beneath the surface. The older generation, Edwin's siblings, his remaining cousins, a few friends from the reservation, they carried themselves differently than the rest of us. There was a tension in their shoulders, a carefulness in the way they spoke. At one point, I saw 2 of my grandfather's cousins speaking near the back door, and when one of them noticed me watching, he stopped mid-sentence and changed the subject with the kind of smoothness that only comes from long practice. I found Dorothy sitting alone on the porch, drinking coffee from a styrofoam cup. She was 86, small and sharp-eyed, with a turquoise ring on every finger. "You look like him," she said when I sat down beside her. "People say that." "People are right." She sipped her coffee. "He was a good man, your grandfather. Carried more than he should have. Carried it longer than anyone should." "Carried what?" She looked at me for a long moment, not unkindly, but with a measuring quality, as if she was deciding how much weight I could hold. "You'll find out," she said. "Or you won't. Depends on whether he left it for you." She wouldn't say more. She just patted my hand and looked out at the desert and drank her coffee like she'd said everything there was to say. That afternoon, the family began the work of sorting through Edwin's belongings. It didn't take long. He was not a man of many possessions. His closet held 6 flannel shirts, 2 pairs of boots, a denim jacket with a broken zipper he'd never repaired. His dresser drawers were neat, nearly empty. A Bible, a pocket knife, a photograph of my grandmother, who had died in 1994, slipped into a leather frame that had been touched so many times. The edges were dark with oil from his fingers. The kitchen was the same, spare, functional. A cast iron skillet, a coffee pot so old the brand name had worn away, and on every windowsill, in every door frame, small things I'd always noticed but never questioned. A line of salt along the kitchen threshold, a bundle of dried cedar tied with string above the back door, a small pouch of something, herbs maybe, or ash, tucked into the corner of each window frame. My mother swept the salt away while cleaning. She threw the cedar bundle into a trash bag without looking at it. She'd grown up with these things. To her, they were just her father's habits, his eccentricities. The residue of a man who was maybe a little too traditional, a little too superstitious, a little too anchored to the old ways. But I remembered as a child asking him about the salt. "What's it for, Grandpa?" He looked at me with those deep brown eyes, serious, steady, no trace of humor. "Boundaries," he said. "For what?" "For things that test them." He'd said it the way you'd say the sky is blue, like it wasn't superstition at all, like it was engineering. I was clearing out the bedroom closet when I found it. The carpet was old, industrial, the color of dust. In the back corner, beneath a pair of worn boots and a folded wool blanket, I felt the floor give slightly under my knee. A soft spot. I pressed again. There was a gap, a seam in the floorboard that didn't match the others. I pulled the carpet back. Underneath, one of the boards had been cut and fitted with a small, recessed handle made from a bent nail. I pulled it up. In the space beneath, maybe a foot deep, lined with an old towel, sat a military-style tin box, olive green, the kind that might have once held ammunition. It was padlocked. The lock was small but solid, the brass darkened with age. I sat there for a while, just looking at it. The house was quiet around me. I could hear my mother in the kitchen, running water, opening and closing cabinets. Outside, the wind moved through the dead juniper, and its bare branches tapped against the wall like fingers asking to come in. I found the key 20 minutes later, taped to the back of the photograph of my grandmother. My grandfather had placed it there deliberately. He'd wanted someone to find the box, but only someone who paid attention. Only someone who looked closely at the things he loved. The lock opened with a click that felt louder than it should have. Inside the box, wrapped in a piece of cloth that smelled like cedar and age, were 7 Cassette tapes. Standard Maxell tapes, the kind you could buy at any gas station in the 1980s. Each one had a small adhesive label on the front, and on each label, written in my grandfather's careful, square handwriting, was a single number, 1 through 7. No titles, no dates, no explanation. Beneath the tapes, pressed flat against the bottom of the box, was a journal. Leather-bound, dark brown, the cover soft and slightly warped as though it had been held in someone's hands for thousands of hours. The pages inside were filled with my grandfather's writing. Dense, small, meticulous. Some entries had dates, some didn't. Some pages had been torn out. On others, certain words had been crossed out so heavily that the pen had gone through the paper. I brought the box to the kitchen table. My mother looked at it and then at me, and something moved behind her eyes. "Where did you find that?" "Under the floor, in the closet." She stared at the box for a long time. Then she said very quietly, "I don't want to know what's on those." "Mom, I mean it." She looked at me, and for the first time that day, I saw something in her face that wasn't grief. It was fear. Old fear. The kind that had been living in her for years, pressed down and covered over, but never gone. He kept things from us for a reason. Whatever reason that was, I trust it. I trust him. She went back to cleaning. I sat at the table with the box open in front of me, and I understood something. My mother knew. Not the details, not the specifics, but she knew there was something. She'd grown up in the shadow of it. She'd spent her childhood following rules she didn't understand, enforced by a man who never raised his voice, but whose eyes, when he spoke about certain things, carried the weight of something that could not be put into words. She had chosen not to look. I was not my mother. That evening, after everyone had left, I sat alone in my grandfather's living room. The house was empty now in a way that felt permanent, not just unoccupied, but abandoned by the specific presence that had made it a home. The cedar smell was fading. The salt was gone from the doorways. The windows were just windows. I'd found an old cassette player in the junk drawer, a small Sony, scratched and dented, with batteries that still worked. I set it on the coffee table. I unwrapped tape 1 from the cloth. I put it in and pressed play. For a few seconds, there was nothing. Just the soft hiss of blank tape and the faint mechanical whir of the reels turning. I leaned forward, and then I heard his voice. Not the voice I knew, not the slow, weathered voice of an old man who measured his words like he was counting out coins. This was younger, tighter. A voice with something pressed against the back of it, something trying to get out. I don't know if anyone will ever hear this. Maybe that's better. Maybe it should stay buried, like I tried to bury it. But I can feel my mind starting to change things, soften the edges, rearrange the details, and I can't let that happen. What happened was real. What I saw was real. What it did, what it still does, is real. And if it's going to live inside me for the rest of my life, then the least I owe it is the truth. A pause, the sound of him breathing, the faint click of a lighter, the long inhale of a cigarette. If you're hearing this, then I'm probably gone. And if I'm gone, then it can't follow the sound of my voice anymore. Another pause, longer this time. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped, not in volume, but in register. The way a person's voice drops when they're about to say something they've been holding in their throat for years. Winter of 1977. I was 24. I took a job at a cattle ranch in the northeast corner of Arizona, about 15 miles south of the reservation line. a place called the Harlan Cattle Company. I'd never heard of it before, and I haven't spoken its name since the night I left. The owner was a man named Dale Harlan. The ranch was 4,000 acres of nothing red dirt, dead brush, and silence. The kind of silence that doesn't feel empty. The kind that feels like something is in it, listening. His voice steadied, as though the act of saying it aloud had unlocked something that had been rusted shut. There were 4 of us working the winter season. Me, a man named Ray, a kid named Thomas, and Dale himself. The nearest town was 2 hours by truck. There was no telephone, no radio that worked reliably. When the weather turned, you were there until it decided to let you leave. He stopped again. I heard him exhale, shaky, thin. I need you to understand something before I go on. I am not a man who frightens easily. I did 2 tours. I've seen things that would make most people sick. But what happened on that ranch, what I heard, what I saw, what walked beside that place in the dark, I have been afraid of it every single day for the last 11 years. I will be afraid of it until the day I die. The tape hissed. It started on the 9th night. The tape kept playing, and my grandfather's voice carried me backward, through decades, through distance, through the thin membrane that separates the world we agree to see from the one that exists just behind it. He said he arrived at the Harlan Cattle Company on the 3rd of November, 1977. He drove in from Flagstaff in a borrowed Ford pickup with a cracked windshield and a heater that only worked on the driver's side. The job listing had been pinned to a corkboard at a feed supply store, handwritten on yellow paper. No phone number, just a P.O. box and a wage that was better than anything else he'd seen in 6 months of looking. He wrote a letter. 2 weeks later, a reply arrived with directions so specific they included landmarks. A split boulder, a dead cottonwood, a cattle guard with 1 broken rail. No road names, no mile markers, just the land, described by a man who had stopped believing that anyone else would ever need to find him. The drive from the last paved road took nearly 2 hours. The dirt track, he couldn't call it a road, wound through terrain that seemed to empty itself the further he went. First the houses disappeared, then the fences, then the power lines, then the tire tracks of other vehicles. By the time the ranch came into view, set against the base of a low red mesa, Edwin said he felt like he'd driven not just into the desert, but into a different version of the world entirely. One that had been left behind by the rest of civilization, and had learned over time not to miss it. The ranch buildings were practical and graceless. A main house of gray cinder block with a pitched metal roof. A long bunkhouse that looked like it had been a horse barn in a previous life. A series of corrals and outbuildings in various states of repair, and a machine shed with a rusted International Harvester tractor parked inside it like a relic in a museum. Beyond the buildings, the land stretched flat and red-brown in every direction, broken only by clusters of piñon and juniper, and the occasional dry arroyo cutting through the earth like a scar that refused to heal. Dale Harlan met him in the yard. He was a tall man, mid-50s, with the weathered look of someone who had spent his life arguing with the land and losing gracefully. His handshake was hard but brief, and his eyes moved past Edwin almost immediately, scanning the horizon the way a man does when he's expecting something he doesn't want to see. "You're the Nez boy," Dale said. Not a question. "Yes, sir." "You ride?" "Since I was 8. "Good." He looked Edwin over once more, then turned toward the house. "Supper's at 6. Bunkhouse is the long building. Take the bunk by the east wall. It's the only one that doesn't leak when it rains." He paused at the door and looked back. We work sun up to sundown. You got a problem with that. The road's right where you left it. He went inside and closed the door, and that was the end of Edwin's welcome. The bunkhouse was cold, drafty, and smelled like diesel and old wool. There were 6 bunks, but only 2 were occupied. The man on the bunk nearest the wood stove was Ray Etzity Navajo, late 40s, built like a fence post, with a stillness about him that Edwin recognized immediately. It was the stillness of a man who listened more than he spoke, not because he had nothing to say, but because he had learned that most things worth knowing announce themselves quietly, and you had to be silent to hear them. Ray looked up when Edwin came in, nodded once, and went back to sharpening a knife on a whetstone. That was it. No introduction, no small talk, just a nod and the soft, rhythmic scraping of steel against stone. The other occupied bunk belonged to Thomas Becenti. Thomas was different, 22, lean, with a quick smile and the kind of restless energy that made a room feel smaller. He was Navajo too, from a town near Shiprock, and he talked the way some people breathe constantly, unconsciously, as if the silence itself was something that needed to be filled before it got ideas of its own. "You're gonna love it here," Thomas said, grinning from his bunk. "Nothing to do, nowhere to go, and the scenery is the same brown dirt in every direction. It's like being on the moon, except the moon probably gets better cell reception." "There's no cell reception out here?" "Brother, there's no anything out here. No phone, no radio worth a damn, no TV. Dale's got a CB in the house, but I've never heard it pick up a signal that wasn't static." He swung his legs off the bunk and extended his hand. "Thomas Becenti. I've been here 6 weeks and I haven't lost my mind yet, so that's encouraging." Edwin shook his hand. He liked Thomas immediately. The way you like someone who makes a cold room feel warmer just by being in it. The 4th person on the ranch was Margaret Harlan, Dale's wife. Edwin met her at supper that first evening. She was a quiet woman with sun-darkened skin and careful hands that moved around the kitchen with the precision of long routine. She set plates down without looking at anyone and spoke only to ask if the food was sufficient. When Edwin thanked her, she glanced at him briefly, a look that held something he couldn't name, and then turned back to the sink. Later that night, after the lanterns were out and the bunkhouse was dark, Edwin lay on his bunk and listened to the silence. It was not the absence of sound, it was something fuller than that. It was as though the land itself was holding its breath, aware, attentive, waiting for something with the patience of a thing that had been waiting for a very long time. He'd slept in remote places before. He'd slept in foxholes in Vietnam with artillery booming in the distance. But this silence was different. It didn't feel empty, it felt occupied. He told himself it was just the desert. He told himself he was tired. The first 2 weeks passed the way work passes in isolated places, slowly, physically, with a rhythm that erased everything beyond the immediate. Up before dawn, coffee so strong it left a film on your teeth. Ride out, check fences, move cattle, fix whatever the wind or the cold or the coyotes had broken in the night. Come back, eat, sleep, do it again. The days blurred into each other, distinguished only by small variations in weather and the gradual shortening of daylight as November bled into December. Edwin found comfort in the work. It was simple and honest, and it left his body tired enough that his mind didn't wander into places he didn't want it to go. He learned the land, the draws and the ridgelines, the places where the cattle liked to shelter, the spots where the ground was soft and the spots where it was hard enough to ring under a horse's hoof like stone. He learned the mesa, which rose above the ranch like a wall at the edge of the world, its flat top always catching the last light of the day, and holding it for a few extra minutes, as though reluctant to let go. He learned the people too. Dale was a fair boss but a distant man, wound tight with something he never named. He drank whiskey alone in the house after supper, and sometimes Edwin could hear him talking to Margaret in a low, urgent voice. Not arguing, exactly, but the tone of a man trying to convince someone, or perhaps himself. Margaret remained a ghost at the edges, present but uninvolved, her silence not passive but deliberate, as though she had made a decision at some point to withdraw from the life happening around her and had never reversed it. Ray was the one Edwin gravitated toward. The older man knew the land with an intimacy that went beyond experience. He could read weather in the way the juniper branches moved. He could smell snow 2 days before it arrived. And he watched things, the sky, the tree line, the ridge line of the mesa, with an attention that seemed excessive until you realized it wasn't casual observation. It was surveillance. "You keep looking out there," Edwin said to him one evening as they sat outside the bunkhouse in the last thin light. "What are you looking for?" Ray didn't answer right away. He rolled a cigarette with slow, deliberate fingers, lit it, inhaled. "I'm not looking for anything," he said. "I'm making sure nothing is looking back." Edwin laughed. Ray did not. Thomas kept the bunkhouse human. He told stories about his family, about a girl in Farmington he was going to marry if she'd have him, about the time he tried to ride a bull at a rodeo and gallop and lasted exactly 1.5 seconds before he was airborne. He sang under his breath while he worked old country songs, Waylon Jennings mostly, slightly off-key but committed. He was the kind of person who made isolation bearable, and Edwin was grateful for him in a way he didn't fully recognize until later, when Thomas was no longer there to be grateful for. On the 16th day, they found the cattle. 3 head in a shallow draw about 2 miles east of the main buildings. They'd been dead for less than a day. The bodies were still faintly warm in the morning cold, but the manner of their death was wrong. Not torn apart by coyotes or mountain lions. Not sick, not starved. They were laid out almost neatly on their sides, as though they had simply decided to lie down and stop. Their eyes were open, their mouths were closed, and each one had been opened a single, precise incision. From throat to belly, and organs had been removed. The heart, the liver, the kidneys. Gone. Taken with a cleanness that no animal jaw could achieve. There was no blood on the ground. Edwin said that again on the tape, slowly, as though he needed the words to land properly. There was no blood on the ground. 3 large animals opened from throat to belly, and the red dirt beneath them was dry and undisturbed. No pooling, no spray, no smearing. As if the blood had been removed along with the organs, or as if it had never been there at all. And there were no tracks, none leading to the draw, none leading away. Just the 3 bodies and the silence and the faint smell of copper hanging in the cold air like a question nobody wanted to ask. Dale said coyotes. He said it quickly, with the kind of certainty that isn't certainty at all, but its opposite. The voice of a man who needs an explanation so badly that he'll accept one he doesn't believe. They buried the cattle and didn't speak about it. That night, Ray burned cedar in the bunkhouse. He didn't explain why. He just lit a bundle and walked the perimeter of the room, letting the smoke curl into every corner, every crack, every gap where the cold air came through. Thomas watched him but didn't joke. Even Thomas, who laughed at everything, didn't laugh at this. 4 days later, a man appeared at the ranch. He came on foot, which was itself remarkable. The nearest settlement was over 20 miles away. He was old, deeply lined, wearing a wool coat and a battered hat, and he walked with the slow certainty of someone who knew exactly where he was going. His name was Hosteen Yellowhorse, and Ray knew him. Edwin could tell by the way Ray's body changed when he saw him, a straightening, a tightening, the way a man's posture shifts when someone he respects arrives carrying news he doesn't want to hear. Yellowhorse spoke to Ray privately, near the corral, for almost an hour. Edwin watched from the bunkhouse window. He couldn't hear what was said, but he could see Ray's face, and what he saw there was not confusion or curiosity. It was recognition, the look of a man who had suspected something and was now being told he was right. After Yellowhorse left, walking back the way he came, into the vast nothing, as though the desert was simply a room he moved through at will. Ray came into the bunkhouse and sat on his bunk. He was quiet for a long time. Then he looked at Edwin. He says someone in this area has been practicing. Practicing what? Ray's jaw tightened. He shook his head once, not in refusal, but in warning. A border he would not cross with words. He says we should leave before the first snow. Did he say why? He didn't have to, Edwin pressed, but Ray shut it down with a finality that was gentle but absolute. Some things you did not say aloud. Some things, by the very act of naming them, you invited closer. Ray said only one more thing that night, quietly, almost to himself, as he lay in his bunk with the cedar smoke still hanging in the air above them. There are people who walk away from what they are, who learn to wear something else. Yellowhorse says one of them is near, and it's hungry. Edwin didn't sleep that night. He lay in the dark with his eyes open, listening to the silence that wasn't silence. And he told himself that Ray was a superstitious man from a superstitious generation, and that whatever Yellowhorse had said was rooted in old stories and old fears that had no place in the real world. He almost believed it. Then, at 2 a.m, he knew the time because he'd been watching the clock on the wall, its hands barely visible in the moonlight. He heard a voice outside the bunkhouse. It was his mother's voice, clear, unmistakable, speaking in Navajo the way she always spoke to him when he was a child, when she would stand on the porch of their home in Window Rock and call him inside for supper. That exact voice, that exact cadence, that exact warmth. Edwin, come here, son. Edwin. His mother was 200 miles away. He did not move. He did not breathe. He lay in the dark and gripped the edges of his mattress and listened to his mother's voice call his name from just outside the wall, inches away, close enough that he could hear the breath between the words, and every cell in his body wanted to answer, wanted to go to her, wanted to open the door and step into the dark and be held. She called 3 more times. Each time the voice was perfect. Each time the warmth in it was flawless. And each time, just beneath the warmth, there was something else, something patient, something studying, something that was listening to the shape of his silence, the way a predator listens for the heartbeat of prey. Then the voice stopped, and he heard it walk away. Not on 2 legs, on 4. Quick, light, clicking against the frozen ground, the gait of something that had been crouching upright, and had now dropped on all 4s, moving fast, moving away, moving with the fluid ease of a thing returning to its natural shape after holding an unnatural one for as long as it needed. Edwin lay in the dark until dawn. He did not close his eyes. Across the room in the faint gray light, he could see Ray, also awake, also staring at the ceiling, also silent. Neither of them said a word. They didn't need to. They both knew what they had heard. Edwin told Ray about the voice the next morning. Not at breakfast, not where Dale or Thomas could hear, but outside in the thin gray light before dawn, standing by the corral where the horses shifted and stamped and blew clouds of white breath into the cold. Edwin spoke quietly, as though the words themselves were dangerous, as though saying them at full volume might give them a weight they weren't meant to carry. Ray listened without interrupting. His face didn't change. His hands didn't move. He stood with his arms folded across his chest and his eyes on the mesa. And when Edwin finished, the silence between them lasted long enough that Edwin began to wonder if Ray had heard him at all. Then Ray spoke. 2 rules. He said them the way a man gives directions to someone standing at the edge of a cliff, calm, precise, and stripped of everything unnecessary. First, you never acknowledge what you heard, not to it, not to anyone except me. If it calls again, and it will call again, you do not answer. You do not move. You do not go to the window. You do not open the door. You lie still and you let it pass. It is testing you. It wants to know if you can hear it, and if you respond, it knows you can, and then it has something to work with. And the second? Ray's eyes moved from the mesa to Edwin's face. Steady, grave. You never say what you think it is. You don't name it. Not in English, not in Navajo, not in any language. If you name it, it knows you can see it. And once it knows you can see it, it stops hiding. Edwin asked what happens when it stops hiding. Ray didn't answer that. He turned and walked toward the bunkhouse, and the set of his shoulders said everything his mouth wouldn't. Edwin stood alone in the cold with his breath rising around him and the horses watching him with their wide, dark eyes. And he noticed for the first time that the horses were pressed together in the far corner of the corral, as far from the eastern fence as they could get. Their ears flat, their muscles taut. Not spooked, not panicked, just aware. The way an animal is aware when it smells something it has no name for, but understands, in the deep architecture of its blood, to be wrong. The days that followed were quiet in the way that a held breath is quiet, not peaceful, but suspended, waiting for the exhale. Edwin worked. He rode the fence lines and mended wire and moved cattle from one pasture to another. He ate. He slept, or tried to. And every evening, as the sun dropped behind the mesa and the light bled from the sky like color draining from a face, he watched. He didn't know exactly what he was watching for, but he watched. It was Thomas who saw it first, or at least Thomas was the first to say it out loud. They were walking back from the south pasture 5 days after the voice when Thomas stopped mid-stride and pointed toward the eastern ridge, a low spine of rock and scrub about half a mile from the main buildings. "Someone's out there." Edwin looked. At first he saw nothing, just the ridge and the pale sky above it, and the dark smudge of juniper along its crest. Then his eyes adjusted, and he saw it. A figure, standing on the ridge, perfectly still. Too still. Not the stillness of a person resting or watching, but the stillness of something that had stopped moving because it knew it was being observed and was choosing, deliberately, to remain exactly where it was. It was shaped like a person. It stood upright. But there was something about the proportions that Edwin couldn't resolve. The arms seemed slightly too long, or the torso slightly too narrow, or the head was tilted at an angle that no comfortable posture would produce. It was like looking at a word written in a language you almost understand, familiar enough to recognize, wrong enough to unsettle. "That's just a juniper trunk," Edwin said, though he knew it wasn't. "Junipers don't stand on ridgelines," Thomas said. They watched it for another 30 seconds. It didn't move. Edwin turned his head to say something to Thomas, and when he looked back, the figure was gone. Not walking away, not ducking behind cover. Simply absent, as though the ridge had swallowed it, or as though it had never been there at all, and the space it had occupied had quietly closed behind it like water. Thomas laughed a short, uncertain sound and said something about his eyes playing tricks. But he walked the rest of the way back to the bunkhouse faster than he needed to, and that night he didn't tell any stories, and the silence he left behind was louder than anything he'd ever said. The figure appeared again the next evening, and the one after that. Always at the edge of the property. Always at dusk, when the light was failing and the world was caught in that uncertain space between clarity and shadow. Sometimes it was on the ridge. Sometimes it was at the tree line north of the corrals. Once Edwin saw it standing in the dry arroyo to the south, just its head and shoulders visible above the bank, watching the buildings with the patience of something that had nowhere else to be. He never saw it arrive. He never saw it leave. It was simply there, and then it wasn't, and the transitions between those two states happened in the spaces between blinks, as though it existed in the margins of perception, the place where the eye stops seeing and the mind starts guessing. Dale saw it too. Edwin knew because Dale started locking the doors of the main house earlier each evening, and because the arguments with Margaret, those low, urgent conversations behind closed doors, grew more frequent and more strained. Once through the kitchen window, Edwin saw Dale standing at the living room window with a rifle in his hands, staring out at the darkness with the rigid posture of a man holding a weapon he suspects will be useless. It was Ray who remained the most composed, though Edwin understood now that Ray's composure was not calm, but discipline, the practiced steadiness of a man who had decided that fear was a luxury he couldn't afford. Ray burned cedar every night. He checked the bunkhouse door and windows before bed with the methodical attention of a soldier inspecting a perimeter. And he watched the tree line with those dark, patient eyes, not with the hope of understanding what was out there, but with the determination to see it coming before it arrived. Then Thomas went out alone. It was a Tuesday. Edwin remembered that clearly. He said it twice on the tape, as though the day of the week mattered, as though anchoring the event to something mundane could keep it from floating away into the territory of things too strange to have happened. Dale had sent Thomas to check the fence line along the eastern boundary, a 5-mile stretch that ran parallel to the base of the mesa. It was a full-day job for one man. Thomas left at sunrise. He was supposed to be back by mid-afternoon. He came back at dusk. He walked in through the bunkhouse door and sat down on his bunk without a word. Edwin asked if the fence was intact. Thomas nodded. Edwin asked if he'd had any trouble. Thomas shook his head. Edwin asked if he was hungry. Thomas looked at him, and for a moment, brief, slippery, gone almost before it registered, Edwin felt something shift, not in the room, in Thomas. Something behind his eyes had rearranged itself. The way a house looks the same from the outside after someone has moved all the furniture inside structurally identical, but the spaces are different. The weight has shifted, and you can feel it even if you can't see it. "I'm fine," Thomas said, and he smiled. And the smile was right, the same easy, lopsided grin that Edwin had come to know over the past month. But it arrived a fraction of a second too late, as though it had been retrieved from somewhere rather than generated naturally, like a man remembering how his own face was supposed to work. Over the next 3 days, the wrongness deepened. It was never dramatic. It was never obvious enough to point to and say plainly that something had changed. It was composed entirely of small things, the kind of details that accumulate below the threshold of certainty, each one individually dismissible, collectively unbearable. Thomas stopped humming. In a month of living together, the man had never gone more than an hour without singing under his breath. Waylon Jennings, Willie Nelson, old hymns his grandmother taught him. Now the bunkhouse was silent when he was in it. Not the comfortable silence of a man at rest, but the dense, attentive silence of a man listening. He started asking questions that didn't fit the shape of his personality. Small, odd questions, delivered in a casual tone that didn't match their strangeness. Do you dream about the same places you've been, or different ones? When you're afraid, where in your body do you feel it first? If someone you loved called your name, could you tell their voice from a copy of their voice? Edwin answered vaguely, deflected, changed the subject. But the questions lingered. They felt like probes, like something was mapping the interior of human experience from the outside, learning the terrain by asking the people who lived there to describe it. And there was the blinking. Edwin couldn't pinpoint when he first noticed it, but once he did, he couldn't stop seeing it. Thomas blinked too slowly. Not dramatically, not the long, languorous blink of someone half asleep. Just slightly delayed, as though each blink was a conscious decision rather than a reflex. As though the body performing the blink had not yet fully automated the process. Edwin told Ray. He whispered it in the dark, after Thomas had fallen asleep, or after whatever Thomas was now, had closed its eyes in an imitation of sleep. I know, Ray said. That was all. 2 words, spoken with the weight of a man who had been waiting for someone else to confirm what he already knew, and wished he didn't. The next morning, Edwin found the tracks. They were in the frost on the north side of the bunkhouse, where the shadow of the building kept the ground cold enough to hold an impression. He had gone out early, before first light, unable to sleep, in the thin layer of yards from the bunkhouse. 4 prints, canine, but wrong. Too large. The pads too spread. The claws too deep, as though the animal they belonged to was heavier than its frame should allow. They moved in a straight line toward the building, deliberate, no wandering, no circling, no hesitation. The gait of something that knew exactly where it was going. Halfway across the clearing, the tracks changed. Not gradually, not over the course of several strides, in a single step. The left print was a paw, broad, clawed, deeply pressed into the frost. The right print, placed 1 stride ahead, was a bare human foot. Edwin stood over that transition paw, foot, and felt something move through him that was not fear, exactly, but a rearrangement of reality. A door in his understanding of the world swinging open to reveal a room he had not known existed and did not want to enter. The 2-legged prints continued to the bunkhouse wall. They stopped directly beneath the window. Thomas's window. The footprints faced the wall, toes almost touching the foundation, as though whoever, whatever, had stood there for a long time, inches from the glass, looking in, watching Thomas sleep, or watching what was wearing Thomas's shape and confirming that it was performing correctly. The prints did not lead away. They simply ended at the wall, as though the thing had pressed itself against the building and been absorbed by it, or as though it had never left. Edwin didn't tell Thomas what he'd found. He wasn't sure he was talking to Thomas anymore. That night, Edwin woke to tapping. Not knocking, tapping, rhythmic, deliberate, patient. The sound of a single fingernail striking glass in a steady pulse, like a heartbeat made audible. It came from the window. His window. He turned his head, slowly. The way you turn towards something when every nerve in your body is screaming at you to look away. A face was pressed against the glass from the outside. It was Thomas's face. The same broad cheekbones, the same dark hair falling across the forehead. The same eyes, except that they caught the moonlight wrong, reflecting it back with a faint luminescence that no human eye should produce, the way an animal's eyes shine when light hits them in the dark. The face smiled. It was Thomas's smile, the same lopsided grin, but stretched. Wider than a human mouth should stretch. The lips pulled back past the point of comfort, past the point of anatomy, and the teeth behind them were too numerous and too uniform, like a mouth that had been filled with teeth by someone who knew how many a person was supposed to have but had erred on the side of generosity. Edwin could not move. His body had seized not with cold, not with paralysis, but with the deep, animal recognition of something that the rational mind refuses to process, but that the body understands instantly. He was prey. He was being looked at by something that considered him prey, and the glass between them was the only reason the looking had not yet become something else. The face held the smile for 5 seconds. 10. Edwin could hear the thing breathing against the window, slow, measured, humid, fogging the glass in a small, rhythmic circle. Then it dropped below the frame. He heard it move beneath the bunkhouse, on all fours, fast. The scrape and click of limbs against packed earth, moving with a fluid, horrible ease, not crawling but running, the way a spider runs, low and spread and articulated in too many places. Then silence. Edwin looked across the room. Thomas's bunk. Thomas was there, asleep, or appearing to sleep. His chest rising and falling, his face slack, normal. But outside, whatever had worn Thomas's face was now beneath the floorboards, and Edwin could feel it there the way you feel a presence in a dark room. Not with your eyes, not with your ears, but with the skin itself. Every hair raised, every pore open, every cell aligned toward the single, overwhelming imperative to remain absolutely still. He did not sleep. When dawn came gray, grudging, late, Edwin rose and walked to Thomas's bunk. It was empty. The sheets were pulled back. The pillow bore the impression of a head. Thomas's boots were on the floor beside the bunk, laces untied. His jacket hung on the hook above. His hat sat on the small shelf where he always left it. Every artifact of his presence was in place, arranged with the careful precision of a display, a museum exhibit of a life that had been vacated. But Thomas was gone. Edwin stood over the empty bunk and looked at the pillow. There, in the center of the indentation, resting on the white cotton with the deliberateness of something placed rather than shed, was a single hair. Not human, coarse, tawny, 4 inches long. Coyote. He picked it up. It was real. It was warm. And holding it, he understood something that his mind had been circling for days, approaching and retreating, afraid to land. Thomas had not left the ranch. Thomas had never come back from the eastern fence line at all. Whatever had walked through the bunkhouse door that evening, wearing Thomas's face and speaking with Thomas's voice and sleeping in Thomas's bed, it was still here. It had been here for days, eating with them, talking with them, asking its strange, careful questions with its strange, careful smile, learning, and now it had shed that shape the way a snake sheds skin and moved on to whatever came next. Edwin dropped the hair. He stepped back from the bunk, and in the silence of the empty bunkhouse, with the first weak sunlight pressing against the windows, he felt the full weight of his situation settle onto him like a hand on his shoulder. He was alone. Ray was outside somewhere. Dale was in the house. Margaret was wherever Margaret went when she disappeared into herself. And something was on this ranch that could wear a human being's face like a coat, and walk among them and smile and laugh and ask about their dreams. And the only way to know it wasn't real was to already know what real was supposed to look like, and to notice, in the terrible specificity of the details, the places where the imitation failed. Edwin stood in the bunkhouse and made a decision. He was not going to run. He was going to understand what he was facing, and he was going to survive it. The argument happened that morning. Dale came out of the main house at sunrise, pulling on his jacket, heading for the bunkhouse the way he did every day. Steady stride, straight back, a man moving through the motions of a life he had built and intended to keep building regardless of what the world placed in his path. But when Edwin told him that Thomas was gone, that his boots were still there, his jacket still there, his hat still on the shelf, but the man himself was simply absent, as though he'd been subtracted from the room while everything around him remained. Dale's face did something Edwin had never seen it do before. It opened. For one unguarded second, the hardness fell away, and beneath it was something raw and pale and entirely afraid. Then he rebuilt himself. You could watch it happen, the jaw setting, the eyes narrowing, the walls going back up brick by brick, mortared with the particular stubbornness of a man who has decided that refusing to believe a thing is the same as that thing not being real. We searched for him, Dale said. He wandered off, got disoriented, maybe fell somewhere. Ray, who had been standing by the corral with his arms folded and his face carved from something harder than patience, shook his head. He didn't wander. You don't know that. I know he left his boots. The words hung in the air. A man doesn't walk into the desert at night without his boots. Not by choice. Not if he's still a man making choices. Dale wanted to organize a search. He wanted to ride out to the eastern fence line, follow the route Thomas had taken, call his name from the ridgelines until the desert gave him back. It was a rational plan. It was a human plan. It was the kind of plan that assumes the problem is one that human effort can solve. Ray refused. I'm not going past the eastern fence, he said, and neither should you. He could be hurt. He could be lying out there right now. Thomas is not lost. Ray's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a man who was done pretending. Thomas is not hurt. Thomas is not Thomas anymore. The silence that followed had a physical texture, dense, pressurized. The air between two men who had arrived at the same truth from opposite directions and could not bear to stand in the same room with it. Dale said something under his breath. Edwin couldn't hear it, didn't want to hear it, and walked back to the house. The door closed behind him, and the sound was final in a way that went beyond wood and hinges. Ray burned more cedar that night. He burned it until the bunkhouse was thick with smoke, until Edwin's eyes watered and his lungs ached, and he understood that the burning wasn't about smell, or tradition, or comfort. It was about creating a barrier, a border made of smoke and intention, drawn around the space where they slept, maintained by a man who understood that some walls are not built with boards and nails but with the older materials, the ones that existed before lumber, before metal, before language itself. The next morning, Edwin made a decision. He told Ray he was going to find Yellow Horse. Ray didn't argue. He didn't warn him. He looked at Edwin for a long time. and in his eyes was something that might have been gratitude. The quiet relief of a man who has been carrying a weight alone and sees someone step forward to share it. "Be back before dark," Ray said. "Whatever you do, be back before dark." Edwin drove east, the road, the same rutted track that had brought him to the ranch weeks earlier, felt different now, narrower, more enclosed. The juniper and pinyon pressed closer on both sides, and the sky, which had always seemed vast and open over this landscape, felt lower, as though the world had contracted slightly while he wasn't looking. He found the settlement after 2 hours, a handful of structures at the mouth of a shallow canyon, where a seasonal creek had once run, and now left only a vein of smooth stones winding through the red earth. He asked for Yellow Horse at the first house. An old woman pointed him toward a hogan set back from the others, near a stand of cottonwoods whose bare branches clawed at the winter sky. Yellow Horse was outside, splitting wood with an axe that looked older than he was. He set the axe down when Edwin approached, but did not invite him closer. He studied Edwin the way a doctor studies a patient, not unkindly, but with a clinical attention that made Edwin feel transparent. "You're one of the men from the Harlan place," Yellow Horse said. Not a question. "Yes." "You've heard it." Edwin hesitated, then nodded. Yellow Horse drove the axe into the chopping block and left it there. He gestured toward a bench beside the hogan door, a plank of weathered wood resting on 2 stones, and sat down heavily, the way old men sit when their bodies have begun to make demands their minds are not yet ready to accept. He did not speak about the thing directly. Edwin understood even then that this was not evasion, it was precision. There are subjects that direct language damages not because the words are inaccurate, but because the act of naming creates a bridge, and some bridges should not be built. Instead, Yellow Horse told a story. He spoke slowly, in a voice that carried the rhythm of someone who had told this story before, and understood that its power lay not in the words, but in the spaces between them. He spoke about a path, a way of knowledge that exists alongside the healing ways, the way a shadow exists alongside the body that casts it. Both are real. Both are connected to the same source. But one faces the light and the other faces away from it. A person who walks the shadow path does not do so by accident. It requires intention, study, sacrifice. It requires the willingness to trade what you are for what you could become. And the final trade, the one that cannot be undone, is the trade of your own humanity. A person who completes this trade, Yellow Horse said, is no longer a person. They have the memory of being a person. They have the shape, the voice, the face. But the thing behind the face has changed. It has become something that wears the human the way you wear a coat. And it can take off one coat and put on another. He paused. A raven called from the cottonwoods, a single harsh syllable that echoed off the canyon walls. It takes the shape by taking the skin, the actual skin, the fur, the hide, the covering of a thing. And with the covering comes the shape and the voice and the movement, but not the soul, never the soul. What you get is a perfect copy of the outside with something entirely different on the inside. Like a house that looks the same from the street, but has been gutted and filled with something that does not belong there. Edwin asked why one of them would come to the ranch. Why there? Why now? Yellow Horse's face changed. Not with surprise, with resignation. The expression of a man confirming something he had hoped was untrue. 2 summers ago, Yellow Horse said, Dale Harlan expanded his grazing land to the east. He brought machinery to the base of the mesa and began clearing ground. His workers found stones, arranged stones, placed in patterns. Old patterns. They found a burial, not a recent one. Old enough that the bones had become part of the earth and the earth had become part of the bones. He stopped, picked up a stick from the ground and turned it in his hands. I went to him. I told him what he had found. I told him the ground was not his, regardless of what papers he held. I told him that the people buried there had been placed with ceremonies that were meant to keep certain things contained, and that disturbing the site would break those ceremonies the way you break a jar all at once, and what's inside spills out. What did he do? What men like him always do. He listened and did not hear. He kept digging, and he found among the remains a bundle, deerskin, old, wrapped around objects that were placed there to bind something, not to preserve it. The bundle was not a gift, it was a lock, and Dale Harlan took the lock home and put it on a shelf, and whatever it was holding shut open. The air in the canyon felt colder. Edwin's hands had gone numb, though the temperature hadn't changed. It was the cold of understanding the particular chill that comes when you realize the danger you're in has a history, a logic, a cause that predates your arrival and will outlast your departure. It didn't come for Dale, Yellow Horse said. Not first. These things are patient. They circle. They test the edges. They find the weakest point and they enter through it. Your friend, the young one, he was open, unguarded. He didn't know what he was walking toward, and by the time it reached him, he had no defenses at all. Edwin asked if Thomas was alive. Yellow Horse didn't answer that question. He looked at the canyon wall, where the late morning sun was painting the sandstone gold, and his silence was its own kind of answer, the silence of a man who will not lie but cannot bring himself to speak the truth. Edwin asked him to come to the ranch, to do what he could, to help. Yellow Horse agreed, though the agreement cost him something. Edwin could see it in the way the old man's shoulders settled, the way his breathing changed to the measured exhale of a man stepping towards something he knows is dangerous, because the alternative is to step away and live with the knowledge that he could have acted and didn't. They drove back together. Yellow Horse sat in the passenger seat with a canvas bag on his lap, and he did not speak for the entire 2-hour drive. His lips moved occasionally prayers, Edwin assumed, or preparations, the internal architecture of a man readying himself for something that required more than physical courage. At the ranch, Yellow Horse worked for 3 hours. He walked the perimeter of the buildings, the bunkhouse, the main house, the corrals carrying a bundle of burning cedar, and singing in a low, steady voice that seemed to push against the air itself, creating a pressure that Edwin could feel in his chest and behind his eyes. He made sand paintings at the 4 cardinal points around the bunkhouse, intricate patterns drawn with colored powders that he carried in small leather pouches. He placed objects, feathers, stones, carved figures at the doorways and windows. The ceremony was not dramatic. It was not theatrical. It was work. The deliberate, exhausting labor of a man building something invisible but real, a wall made of faith and tradition, and the accumulated weight of generations of people who had faced this particular darkness, and survived it long enough to teach their children how to face it too. When he finished, Yellow Horse stood in the yard with his hands at his sides, and his face drawn with fatigue. Dale watched from the house, visible through the window, his expression unreadable. Ray stood nearby, and for the first time since Edwin had known him, his posture was not vigilant, but relieved the cautious relief of a man who has been handed a weapon after fighting barehanded. But Yellow Horse's final words dissolved that relief as quickly as it had formed. "This will hold the door," he said, looking at Edwin and Ray in turn. "But the door is already open. Someone inside may have already let it through, and what is already inside cannot be kept out." He left the way he had come, not in the truck, but on foot, walking east into the desert, with his canvas bag and his measured stride, and the land seemed to absorb him the way it absorbed everything, folding him into its silence until he was just another shape on the horizon, and then not even that. That evening, while Dale was out checking the cattle and Ray was reinforcing the bunkhouse shutters, Edwin went into the main house. He told himself he was looking for answers. He told himself he needed to see the bundle, the deerskin package that Yellow Horse had described, the lock that Dale had removed from its resting place and brought into his home. He told himself that understanding the source of the problem was the first step toward solving it. But beneath the reasoning, beneath the logic, there was something else driving him. A compulsion. The same force that makes a person look down when they're standing at the edge of a great height, not because they want to fall, but because the depth demands to be seen. The cellar was beneath the kitchen, accessed through a trapdoor that was partially concealed by a threadbare rug. The stairs were narrow and steep, built from boards that groaned under Edwin's weight. The air below was cold and still and smelled of earth and something else, something faintly sweet, faintly metallic, like old flowers left in water too long. The space was small, stone walls, dirt floor, bare bulb overhead that Edwin pulled on with a hanging chain. Shelves lined one wall, holding canned goods and tools and the accumulated debris of a household that threw nothing away. On the opposite wall, behind a stack of wooden crates that looked as though they had been placed to block access rather than store goods, Edwin found a section of wall where the stones had been removed and replaced with a rough wooden panel. He pulled the panel aside. Behind it, on a narrow shelf cut into the earth itself, sat the bundle. Deerskin, dried and cracked with age, wrapped tightly around something solid and tied with sinew that had darkened to the color of old blood. It was smaller than Edwin expected, no bigger than a loaf of bread, but it carried a weight that had nothing to do with mass. Holding it, he felt a pressure in his skull, behind his eyes, as though something was pressing against the inside of his forehead, trying to look out through his face. He unwrapped it. Inside were bone fragments, human, he was certain, though he was no expert. Small pieces, cracked and yellowed, arranged around a central object. A leather pouch, stiff with age, filled with a fine gray powder that smelled like nothing he had ever encountered. Not unpleasant, not pleasant. Simply alien, a scent that belonged to no category his memory could provide. He rewrapped the bundle and placed it back, but before he replaced the wooden panel, he looked at the wall behind the shelf. The stone was scratched. Deep, deliberate grooves carved into the surface, not random marks, but patterns. Lines and angles that repeated and connected, forming shapes that were almost letters, almost symbols, almost words in a language that existed before alphabets. And among the scratches, fresher than the others, cut into the stone with something sharp and desperate, were claw marks. 4 parallel lines gouged deep, not scratching to get out, scratching to get in. Edwin replaced the panel. He stacked the crates. He climbed the stairs and closed the trapdoor and stood in the kitchen with his hands shaking and his breath coming too fast. Margaret Harlan was standing at the counter. She was watching him. Not with surprise, she had known he was down there. She had probably known since the moment he entered the house. Her face was calm, but it was the calm of exhaustion, the calm of a woman who had been afraid for so long that the fear had become indistinguishable from the rest of her life. "He should have put it back," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I told him to put it back. The night he brought it home, I told him. I felt it. The moment it came through the door, I felt the house change. Like the walls got thinner. Like something on the outside could suddenly hear us breathing." Edwin couldn't speak. He stood there, his hands still trembling, and listened. He wouldn't listen. She shook her head, a small, defeated motion. "He said it was artifacts, history. He said I was being superstitious, but I grew up on this land. I know what superstition is, and I know what it isn't. And this isn't." She turned to the window. Outside, the sun was setting, and the sky was the color of a bruise, deep purple and yellow at the edges, fading to black. "It comes to my window every night," she said. "Every night since he brought that bundle home. It stands outside the glass, and it breathes, and it waits. And it speaks to me." She looked at Edwin, and her eyes were not frightened. They were something beyond frightened, a place past fear, where the only thing left is the slow, grinding endurance of a person who has accepted that they are living inside a nightmare, and that waking up is not an option. "Every night it asks me to open the door, and every night it sounds more like someone I love." The snow began falling on a Thursday afternoon. Not gently, not in the soft, drifting way that snow sometimes arrives in the high desert, where the flakes are thin and uncertain and melt before they reach the ground. This was different. The sky closed like a fist, a low iron-gray ceiling pressing down on the mesa and the ranch and everything in between, and the snow came in curtains, thick and steady and deliberate, as though the weather itself had decided that no one was leaving. By 4 o'clock, the dirt road that led to the highway had disappeared. By 5, the corrals were filling, the fence posts shrinking into white drifts, and the world beyond the ranch buildings had been erased, replaced with a flat, featureless blank that could have been a mile deep or 1,000 miles deep, and there was no way to know which. Edwin and Ray spent the remaining daylight preparing the bunkhouse. They worked without speaking much. The communication between them had become something beyond words, a shared understanding transmitted through glances and gestures, and the economy of men who know exactly what they're afraid of and have stopped pretending otherwise. They boarded the windows. Not all of them, they left narrow gaps at the top of each one, just wide enough to see through, not wide enough for anything to fit. Ray lined every doorframe with cedar, not bundles this time, but a solid, unbroken border of dried branches stripped from the trees behind the bunkhouse, packed tight into the gaps between wood and frame until the entire perimeter smelled like a forest that was slowly, deliberately burning. Salt along every threshold, along the windowsills, along the base of the walls where the boards met the foundation. Edwin watched Ray lay the lines with a precision that was almost architectural. No gaps, no breaks, no interruptions in the white border that now ran the full circumference of the building. "Will this hold?" Edwin asked. Ray pressed the last handful of salt into the corner where the east wall met the south wall. He sat back on his heels and looked at his work. "It'll help," he said. And the distance between help and hold was the width of everything they weren't saying. Dale refused to come to the bunkhouse. Edwin went to the main house to tell him what they were doing, to ask him to join them, to at least try. Dale stood in his kitchen with a glass of whiskey in his hand, and the deerskin bundle on the table in front of him. He'd retrieved it from the cellar, Edwin realized, and was sitting with it the way a man sits with a loaded gun he hasn't decided whether to use. "I'm going to take it back," Dale said. His voice was flat, scraped clean of everything except a decision that had been made somewhere deep and could not be unmade. "I'm going to take it back to where I found it and put it in the ground, and this is going to stop." "Not tonight," Edwin said. "Dale, not in the dark." Dale looked at him. His eyes were red and dry, the eyes of a man who hadn't slept in longer than his body could sustain. Behind the exhaustion was something Edwin recognized: guilt, massive and structural, the kind that doesn't live in the mind, but in the bones, in the architecture of the body itself. Dale Harlan knew what he had done. He knew he had opened something that was never meant to be opened. And the knowing was eating him from the inside, the way termites eat a house invisibly, steadily, until the whole structure is nothing but a shell waiting to collapse. "After dawn," Edwin said. "We'll go together." Dale didn't respond. Edwin left. Margaret was nowhere in the house. He didn't go looking for her. The sun set at 5:14. Edwin remembered the time because he watched the last sliver of orange light slide behind the mesa like a door being pulled shut, and looked at the clock on the bunkhouse wall and committed the number to memory. 14 hours until sunrise, 14 hours of darkness. He and Ray sat in the bunkhouse with the wood stove burning, the cedar smoking, the salt in its unbroken lines, and the wind outside pressing against the walls with a sound like breathing. They didn't talk. There was nothing left to say that would make the waiting easier. They sat and they listened, and they watched the boarded windows and the bolted door, and the minutes passed with the slow grinding weight of stones being dragged across gravel. The silence came at 8. Not gradually, instantly. One moment, there was wind, the steady, moaning push of a winter storm against a building, and the next, nothing, absolute zero. The cessation was so complete and so sudden that Edwin's ears rang with it, the way they ring after a loud noise, except this was the opposite. This was the sound of sound being removed. The wind didn't die down, it stopped, as though someone had pressed a finger against the lips of the world and said enough. No wind, no creaking, no settling of boards or shifting of snow, no animals, no insects, nothing. The silence had weight. It pressed against the walls of the bunkhouse from outside, dense and material, and Edwin felt it on his skin, a pressure, a closeness, as though the air itself had thickened and was now watching them through the gaps in the boards. Ray stood up. He moved to the stove and added more wood. The fire cracked and popped, and the sound was almost violent in the stillness. Each snap a small explosion that the silence swallowed immediately, leaving no echo, no residue, as though the noise had been consumed. Then the footsteps. On the roof, directly above them. Not running, walking. The slow, deliberate rhythm of something moving across the corrugated metal with no attempt at stealth. Each step rang through the bunkhouse, a hollow metallic note that vibrated in Edwin's sternum and made his teeth ache. 4 steps. Pause. 4 more. Pause. The pattern of a quadruped moving with purpose, stopping to listen, moving again. It circled the full length of the roof from the north end to the south, and then came back. And on the return trip, the rhythm changed. 4-legged became 2-legged. The steps grew heavier, spaced farther apart. The gait of something that had risen from 4 points of contact to 2 and was now walking upright above them, its weight pressing the metal downward with each step, until Edwin could see the roof flex inward, shallow incremental dips in the corrugated surface, like the ceiling was being pressed by a thumb. It stopped in the center, directly above the wood stove, directly above the place where Edwin and Ray sat, and through the stovepipe, the narrow metal chimney that rose through the roof and out into the night, came a sound. Breathing, slow, deep. The long, measured inhale and exhale of something that was taking its time. Something that was enjoying this. Ray reached for the cedar. He held a smoldering branch beneath the stovepipe, and the smoke curled upward, climbing the chimney in a pale thread. From above, a hiss, sharp, guttural, involuntary, and the footsteps moved away from the pipe. But they did not leave the roof. The voices started at 9. First, Thomas. Thomas's voice coming from the west wall at the level of the window. Cheerful, casual, the easy tone of a man coming home from a long day's work. "Hey, it's freezing out here. You gonna let me in or what?" Perfect, every inflection, every cadence, every shade of warmth and humor that had made Thomas the person he was, reproduced with the fidelity of a recording played back at the exact right speed. Edwin closed his eyes. The voice was so accurate that his body responded before his mind could override it. His hand moved toward the door, a reflex, the instinct of a man hearing a friend ask for help. Ray caught his wrist, held it, said nothing. Didn't need to. The voice tried again. Softer this time, closer to the window. "Come on, man, I'm hurt. I fell out by the ridge and I think my ankle's broken. I just need to get warm, please." A pause, and then, barely audible, almost a whisper. "Edwin, please, it's me." Edwin pressed his palms against his eyes and breathed and did not answer. The voice changed. It shifted not gradually, not through any transition, but instantaneously, the way a radio dial jumps from one station to another. Now it was deeper, older. A man's voice, rough with age and tobacco. "Dale, open the door, son. It's your father." From the main house faintly, through the storm and the snow in the distance, Edwin heard something. A cry. Dale's voice, muffled, raw. The voice outside continued. Dale's father. A man who had been dead for 11 years, speaking through the wall of the bunkhouse, with the patient insistence of someone who has all the time in the world and knows that eventually, everyone opens the door. "I've been out here a long time, son. A long time in the cold. Won't you let me in? Won't you let your father come home?" And then it used Edwin's own voice, his exact voice, speaking to him from outside the wall. And it said, "I know you can hear me. I know you're awake. I've been watching you for weeks and I know what you're afraid of. And I want you to understand something. The cedar doesn't work. The salt doesn't work. Those are old tricks and I am older. I'm being patient with you because patience is more interesting than force. But patience has an end." The silence that followed was worse than the voice, because the voice, however wrong, however impossible, was at least a present, something to react to, something to push against. The silence was an absence that felt like a held breath, and Edwin could not tell whether it belonged to the thing outside or to himself. Then the hand. A gap in the window boards barely 2 inches wide near the bottom of the west window, where a knot in the wood had left a space they hadn't noticed. Through this gap, in the pale blue light of the snow glow, a hand reached in. It was human in the way that a drawing of a hand is human, the right number of fingers, the right general proportions, but wrong in the specifics. The fingers were too long. The joints were too numerous, not 5 knuckles per finger, but 6 or 7, each one bending independently, articulating with a fluid, exploratory delicacy that no human hand possesses. The skin was pale, almost gray and dry, and it moved through the gap with the boneless ease of something that understood the shape of a hand but was not bound by its limitations. It reached into the room and opened its fingers, spreading them wide as though feeling the air, tasting it, learning the temperature, the humidity, the fear. Ray moved faster than Edwin had ever seen a human being move. The knife, the same knife he had been sharpening that first day, the blade worn thin from years of use, crossed the space between his hand and the reaching fingers in a single arc. The blade connected. The hand withdrew fast, snapping back through the gap with a wet, sucking sound, and something dripped from the wound onto the windowsill and the salt line beneath it. It was dark, thicker than blood, and where it touched the salt blackened and dissolved, and a smell rose from the reaction, sweet, chemical, wrong, that made Edwin's stomach lurch. From outside, a sound. Not a scream, not a howl. Something between them, a vocalization that contained elements of both human pain and animal fury, braided together into a single note that climbed in pitch, until it was beyond hearing, and Edwin felt it not in his ears, but in his fillings, in his joints, in the marrow of his bones. Then running, on the roof, on the ground, around the building, fast, faster than anything should move. The sound of many limbs striking hard ground, not 4, not 2, but something in between, something that shifted its method of locomotion, the way a person shifts their weight, fluidly and without thought. Then Dale opened the door of the main house. Edwin saw it through the gap in the window boards. The front door of the main house swung open, and Dale stepped out into the snow. He was carrying the deerskin bundle in both hands, held out in front of him like an offering. He was wearing no coat, no hat, just his shirt and his jeans and his boots, and the snow was falling on his shoulders and his hair, and he didn't seem to feel it. He walked 30 feet from the door, 40, heading toward the tree line with the rigid, mechanical stride of a man who has made a decision so final that his body is simply executing the last instructions his mind will ever give. He stopped. Edwin watched. Ray watched. They pressed their faces to the narrow gap in the boards and watched Dale Harlan stop in the snow, 50 feet from the main house at the edge of the light. He turned around, and he was smiling. But it was not Dale's smile. The proportions were right. The muscles were in the correct positions. The face was undeniably Dale Harlan's face. But the expression behind it, the intelligence animating it, was something else entirely. Something that understood what a smile was supposed to communicate and was using it the way a hunter uses a call, not to express, but to attract. Dale did not walk back to the house. He turned slowly toward the darkness beyond the tree line, and he walked into it. The snow swallowed his footsteps. The dark swallowed his shape, and somewhere, just past the point where the light failed, Edwin heard a sound, soft, brief, almost gentle, that might have been a sigh of satisfaction. The thing came back, one final time. In the hour before dawn, it hurled itself against the bunkhouse walls with a force that knocked tools from their hooks and sent canned goods tumbling from shelves. It circled the building in a frenzy, slamming, clawing, screaming in a voice that was no longer pretending to be human, a raw and ancient sound that contained within it the compressed fury of something that has been denied and does not understand denial, because denial requires recognition, and recognition requires the other thing to matter. And this thing, whatever it was, had not considered the possibility that anything besides itself could matter. Ray stood in the center of the room with the burning cedar held above his head and sang. Not loudly, not desperately, steadily. The same song Yellow Horse had sung. A barrier made of sound and smoke and the stubborn, unreasonable refusal to stop believing that barriers can hold. The singing held. The first light hit the mesa at 7:06 a.m. The assault stopped. Not gradually. The way a switch is thrown one state to another. Violence to silence. Presence to absence. The thing left the way darkness leaves a room when you turn on a lamp, not retreating, simply ceasing to exist in the space it had occupied. Edwin and Ray waited 30 minutes. Then they unbolted the door. The world outside was white and still and empty in a way that felt surgical, cleaned, sterilized, stripped of everything that had happened in the night. The snow was unmarked except in one place. Around the bunkhouse, in a perfect spiral, hundreds of tracks, human, animal. Things that were neither impressions with too many toes or no toes at all, or shapes that suggested limbs arranged in configurations that no living anatomy should produce. The tracks circled the building in concentric rings, tightening inward like the grooves of a record, and each ring was a different type of print, as though the thing had walked its perimeter in a different shape each time, cycling through its collection of forms the way a person flips through a wardrobe, and leading away toward the mesa, toward the eastern fence line, toward the place where Yellow Horse had said the burial was a single set of boot prints, Dale's boots. The tread was distinctive, the heel worn on the left side. His prints walked in a straight line, steady and unhurried, the gait of a man going home. Beside the boot prints, four-legged tracks, canine, large, walking at the same pace, at the same stride, matching Dale's steps perfectly, side by side, like companions. They found Margaret in the cellar. She was sitting on the dirt floor with her back against the stone wall, her arms wrapped around her knees, her eyes open but seeing nothing. The Bible from the kitchen was in her lap, pressed flat against her chest. She was breathing. She was alive. But wherever Margaret was, it was not in that cellar, and it was not in that house, and it was not anywhere that words could reach. Edwin carried her to the truck. Ray drove. They did not look back at the ranch. They did not stop for anything. They drove through the snow in silence, following the road by memory, because the road itself had been erased by the storm, and the only thing that told them they were going the right direction was the slow, gradual reappearance of the world. First a fence post, then a mailbox, then a power line, then the thin gray ribbon of pavement signs that other people existed, that the world beyond the ranch was still there, still functioning, still ignorant of what had happened in the dark. 30 miles from the ranch, Edwin pulled over. He got out of the truck and stood on the shoulder of the highway and vomited into the snow. Not from sickness, from release. The held breath of an entire night finally leaving his body, taking with it everything he had swallowed: the fear, the adrenaline, the sounds, the faces, the smell of that dark fluid on the windowsill, the sight of Dale turning around in the snow with something else behind his smile. He stood in the cold and breathed and looked at the empty road stretching away in both directions, and the sun was up and the sky was blue and the world was ordinary and quiet, and none of it mattered, because he understood now that ordinary was a surface, a thin crust over something deeper and older and infinitely patient, and the crust could break at any time. It had broken once already, and the thing beneath it was still there, still waiting, still wearing whatever face it needed to wear to get you to open the door. They drove Margaret to a hospital in Gallup. It took 4 hours through the snow, 4 hours of silence, in the cab of the truck with Margaret in the middle, her body upright, but her eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the windshield, beyond the road, beyond the reach of anything Edwin could say or do. She breathed, her heart beat. Her hands rested in her lap, still holding the Bible. Her fingers pressed into the leather cover with a grip that had gone past conscious effort and become something mechanical. Something the body was doing because the mind had left and the body didn't know what else to hold on to. At the hospital, they told the staff she'd had a shock. A bad one. They said her husband had gone missing in the storm and she'd been alone in the house all night. The staff asked questions that Edwin answered with the parts of the truth that could survive translation into the language of the ordinary world. Yes, she was responsive yesterday. No, she didn't have a history of this. Yes, the husband had been under stress. The doctors nodded and wrote things down and wheeled Margaret through a set of double doors. And Edwin watched her go with the specific grief of a man who knows he has just told a story that is true in its facts and false in everything that matters. Ray was waiting by the truck. He'd been standing in the parking lot, smoking, watching the sky with those dark, steady eyes. The storm had broken. The clouds were thinning from the east, and the first blue sky Edwin had seen in days was showing through the gaps like something fragile that the weather had been hiding. They stood together for a while without speaking. There was a quality to their silence now that was different from the silences of the ranch, not tense, not watchful, but heavy. The silence of two men standing on the far side of something that had changed them in ways they would spend the rest of their lives trying to understand. Ray finished his cigarette. He crushed it under his boot and looked at Edwin, and his face held something Edwin had never seen in it before: tenderness. Not the tenderness of affection, but the tenderness of shared damage. The particular gentleness that exists between people who have survived the same thing and know that no one else will ever fully believe them. "You don't tell this story," Ray said. "Not to your wife, not when you get one, not to your children, not when you have them. You carry it. You carry it the way you'd carry a coal in your hand, carefully, because it burns, but tightly, because if you drop it, it sets fire to everything around you." Edwin asked why. "Because telling it is how it follows you. The story is the path. Every time you speak it, you lay the path a little closer to wherever you are. You keep it inside you. The path stays where it is back there, at the ranch, in the ground where it belongs. You let it out, and the path moves. It finds you. It finds the people who heard it." Ray put his hand on Edwin's shoulder. The weight of it was warm and solid and real. "Let it die with you. That's how you protect them," Edwin promised. They parted at the hospital parking lot. Ray drove north, Edwin drove south. They did not exchange addresses. They did not exchange phone numbers. They did not promise to stay in touch, because staying in touch meant keeping a thread alive, and threads can be followed. Edwin never saw Ray Etzedy again. The tape ended there, the click of the recorder stopping, the whir of the reel spinning to its end. Then silence, the real kind. The kind that belongs to an empty room in an empty house where a man has just finished listening to his dead grandfather's voice describe the worst thing that ever happened to him. I sat on the couch for a long time. The cassette player was warm in my hands. The bunkhouse, the ranch, the snow, it all felt impossibly close, as though the distance between 1977 and the room I was sitting in had collapsed, and the only thing separating me from what my grandfather had experienced was the thin plastic shell of a Maxell cassette tape, and the 47 years it had been waiting in a box beneath the floor. I picked up the journal. The entries spanned decades. They began in 1978, short, clipped, written in a hand that was still young and still shaking, and continued through the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, all the way to an entry dated 14 months before his death. The handwriting aged across the pages. The letters grew smaller, tighter, more controlled, as though Edwin was teaching himself, year by year, to compress what he felt into the smallest possible space. The early entries were about adjustment, moving to New Mexico, getting work, trying to sleep through the night. He wrote about the dreams, not nightmares exactly, but recurrences. The same images returning in different arrangements. The mesa, the window, the tracks in the frost. The sound of 4 legs becoming 2. The dreams didn't terrorize him. They persisted. They sat in his sleep like furniture in a room he could never quite leave. He married my grandmother in 1980. The entries around that time were sparse, almost reluctant, as though happiness was something he felt guilty about. He loved her, that was clear in the way he wrote about her, the careful, precise tenderness of a man describing something he was afraid to hold too tightly. But he never told her. Not about the ranch, not about Thomas, not about Dale walking into the snow with someone else behind his smile. He kept his promise to Ray, and the keeping was a kind of violence against himself, a daily act of compression, pushing the story deeper, holding it down, refusing to let it surface, no matter how hard it pressed against the underside of his days. The rules appeared in the journal around 1982, when my mother was born. They were written in list form, underlined, revisited, and expanded over the years. Never whistle after dark. Never answer a knock past midnight, unless you can see who's there. Keep cedar and salt near every door. Never mimic the sound of an animal at night. Never leave a window open after sunset. Never, ever speak about what happened. These were not superstitions. I understood that now. They were protocols, security measures. A perimeter defense designed by a man who had seen what happens when the perimeter fails, and who had spent the rest of his life making sure the line held. Every bundle of cedar, every line of salt, every closed window and unanswered door. These were the acts of a soldier standing watch over his family, protecting them from something they couldn't see, fighting a war they didn't know was being fought. There were other entries, scattered through the years, moments where Edwin thought he saw something, a shape at the edge of his vision, a figure standing too still at the periphery of a parking lot, a dog that watched him with too much intelligence from the far side of a fence. Moments where he heard something, a voice that sounded familiar, calling from a place where no one should be, tapping at a window in the deep hours of the night. The sound of breathing on the other end of a phone line that rang at 3 a.m. and showed no number on the caller ID. He never knew if these were real. That was the cruelest part. The thing about living with what he knew was that it made the ordinary world unreliable. Every shadow could be a shape. Every sound could be a signal. Every coincidence could be a test. He spent 50 years in a state of sustained vigilance, unable to confirm that the danger was present, but equally unable to confirm that it was gone. And the uncertainty was its own form of captivity. A prison with no walls and no bars, just the endless, exhausting possibility that the door you forgot to lock was the one that mattered. I reached the final tape at 1 a.m. I almost didn't play it. Something in me, something I recognized as inherited, a reflex passed down from a man that I was only now beginning to understand, told me to stop, to close the box, to put it back beneath the floor and nail the board down and walk away and never come back. I played it anyway. His voice on the last tape was different. Older decades, older, thinner, slower, carrying the weight of a body that had been asked to endure more than its share. But the steadiness was still there, the precision, the habit of a man who had been speaking carefully for so long that care had become indistinguishable from nature. "I broke my promise to Ray," he said. "I'm recording this because I realized he was wrong. Not about the danger, about the silence." He said silence was protection. He said the story was the path. And maybe he was right. Maybe every time I speak, I'm laying stones on that path, bringing it closer. But silence isn't the same as protection. Silence is just ignorance, with a better reputation. And if this thing ever finds you, if it ever comes to your window and calls your name in a voice you love, you need to know what you're facing. You need to know it's real. You need to know the rules, because the rules are the only thing I have to give you. And I'd rather give you the truth and the danger than the ignorance and the vulnerability. He paused, the sound of him breathing. Slower now, labored, an old man with a failing heart, speaking into a machine because the alternative was to take this with him into the ground and leave the people he loved defenseless. "There's something I never put in the journal," he said. "Something I never told anyone, not Ray, not your grandmother, not God." The tape hissed. I leaned closer. 3 years after I left the ranch, I went back. My hands tightened on the cassette player. I don't know why. I've asked myself that question 1,000 times, and I've never arrived at an answer that satisfies me. Maybe I needed to see it again. Maybe I needed to confirm it was real. Maybe something in me needed to stand in that place and feel the weight of it, and know for certain that I hadn't invented the worst experience of my life. He coughed, a long, rattling sound. The ranch was abandoned. The buildings were still standing, but the windows were broken, and the corrals had collapsed, and the desert was taking it back the way the desert takes everything back, slowly, patiently, with the certainty of something that knows it was there first and will be there last. The bunkhouse was empty. The main house was empty. Everything was exactly as you'd expect an abandoned ranch to look. A pause. Except the cellar. Another pause, longer. The kind of pause that a man takes when he's standing at the edge of something and looking down. I went into the cellar. I don't know why. I went down those stairs and pulled the chain on the light and moved the crates and pulled back the panel. And the bundle was there, on the shelf, wrapped in deerskin, tied with sinew, exactly as it had been before Dale took it, before I unwrapped it, before any of this happened. Placed back, neatly, carefully, as though something had retrieved it from wherever Dale had carried it and returned it to its place. His voice dropped. And on the wall, behind the shelf, and the scratches, the old ones, the ones that had been there before. A new word, cut into the stone with something sharp, cut deep, the grooves still pale with fresh dust. I could hear him swallow. My name, Edwin Nez, written in the stone, in my own handwriting. The tape ran for another 30 seconds, just breathing. Just the quiet, measured breathing of a man who had carried that knowledge for decades and was finally, at the end of his life, setting it down. Then he said, "I love you, whoever you are. Whoever is listening, I love you, and I'm sorry, and I hope the cedar and the salt were enough." The tape ended. I sat in the dark. The cassette player clicked off. The house was silent, the permanent, settled silence of a place whose occupant is never coming back. The cedar smell that had defined this house for as long as I could remember was fading. My mother had thrown the bundles away that afternoon. The salt was gone from the doorways, swept up, wiped clean. The windows were just windows. The doors were just doors. The perimeter my grandfather had maintained for half a century had been dismantled in a single afternoon by people who loved him and didn't understand what they were undoing. I looked at the tin box. The tapes were stacked inside it. The journal rested on top. I moved to close the lid, and as I did, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. On the inside of the lid, the underside of the metal, where you'd only see it if you were closing the box from above, words had been scratched into the surface. Not written, scratched, with a nail or a knife point or the tip of a key. My grandfather's handwriting, small and square and unmistakable. Don't play these after dark. I looked at the clock on the wall. The same clock from the tape, the one Edwin had watched on the longest night, counting the hours until dawn. 2:47 a.m. I closed the box. I set it on the table. I looked at the windows, dark rectangles of glass, reflecting nothing but the dim interior of the room, and the shape of my own face, staring back at me from the other side of the glass like someone I didn't quite recognize. And then I heard it. Not a voice, not a knock, not a tapping or a scratching, or any of the sounds my grandfather had described on those 7 tapes. Something simpler, something worse. Breathing. From just outside the window. Slow, patient. The long, measured rhythm of something exhaling against the glass, not fogging it. Not quite, but present, close, occupying the space between the window and the night with a density that had nothing to do with air and everything to do with attention. Something was outside. Something was breathing against the glass of my dead grandfather's window. And it was not in a hurry. It had the patience of a thing that had been waiting for a very long time, waiting through decades of cedar smoke and salt lines and closed windows and silence, waiting through the years of a man's careful, vigilant, exhausting life. And now that man was gone, and the smoke had cleared, and the salt had been swept away, and someone had finally spoken the story out loud in this house, and the path Ray had warned about, the path made of words and memory, and the simple act of telling that path had been laid, and the thing at the end of it had followed it here, to this window, to this room, to this moment. I did not go to the window. I sat in the dark and I listened to the breathing, and I understood fully, completely, with the terrible clarity that only comes when understanding arrives too late to be useful, why my grandfather lived the way he did. Why the cedar, why the salt, why the silence that my mother mistook for stubbornness and his siblings mistook for superstition, and the world mistook for the eccentricity of an old man who couldn't let go of the old ways. He wasn't holding on to the old ways. He was holding the door shut. And now the door was open, and the thing on the other side was patient, and the night was long. And I was alone in a house with no salt on the thresholds, and no cedar in the door frames, and no one to tell me the rules, because the man who knew them was in the ground, and that the story he had kept buried was now alive in my chest, breathing inside me the way the thing outside was breathing against the glass. Some stories don't end when you stop telling them. Some stories end when they find the next person willing to listen. And I had listened. And outside the window, in the dark, something breathed and waited and smiled with a mouth I couldn't see. And I understood, at last, that my grandfather's story was no longer his. It was mine.